The frost was a skin of glass clinging to the mortar of the abandoned bell tower, and the wind, funneling through the shrapnel holes, sounded like 1,000 voices sighing. Elias pressed the small, cracked photograph deeper into the palm of his glove, seeking the faint, almost psychic warmth that radiated from the stiff, slick paper. It was a stupid, dangerous thing to keep, yet it was the only thing preventing the absolute, suffocating silence of this watch from crushing him entirely. Below, the valley was a monochrome wash of snow and burnt timber, stretching towards the enemy line. An invisible border where men ceased to be men and became only targets. Elias hadn't looked at the photo properly since he found it 3 days prior, not with the full, unforgiving light of day upon him. Now, in the deep blue hour just before midnight, he allowed his eyes to trace the details. It was cheap, slightly blurry, taken perhaps on a cloudy afternoon. The man in the picture, wearing a heavy, ill-fitting coat, smiled awkwardly, eyes squinting slightly against the weak light. He was the enemy, but it wasn't the man who captivated Elias. It was the dog, a shaggy, brown mutt, ears floppy, standing patiently beside the man's knee. The dog looked profoundly bored, utterly unconcerned with the war, the politics, or the fact that the man holding its leash was now nothing but a frozen memory in a shallow grave. This simple image, a man and his dog, felt louder than any artillery barrage. It was proof, undeniable and physical, that the hollow-eyed monster Elias had killed 3 days ago had once had a life anchored by the simplest kind of love, the kind of love that transcends language, uniform, and doctrine. Elias shivered, and it wasn't just the biting 0-degree temperature. It was the realization that the last human connection this man possessed now rested in the pocket of the person who extinguished him, a connection Elias was suddenly terrified to lose. He felt the cold reaching into his bones, but the tiny square of paper was a desperate, feverish heat against the dying light of his own conscience. The discovery had been clinical, brutal, and necessary. The ambush had been quick, less than 5 minutes of panicked, deafening chaos inside the ruins of the old railway station. 3 of the enemy patrol were down. Elias's team had been tasked with a quick sweep for intelligence before the retreating sounds of the rest of the patrol vanished into the pine woods. When Elias knelt beside the last soldier, the one he was almost certain his own rifle had stopped, the man's face was already dusted lightly with fresh snow. Following protocol, Elias began the methodical search of pockets for maps, documents, or personal effects. His fingers, numb despite the thick gloves, fumbled with the button on the breast pocket. He hesitated not because of squeamishness, that emotion had long since been incinerated by the war, but because the man's coat was so thick, so civilian in appearance, suggesting a terrible unpreparedness for the front lines. Tucked deeply inside, beneath a crumpled transit pass, was the worn leather wallet. Inside the wallet, not taped to a helmet or pinned to a wall, but nested carefully in the billfold, was the photograph. Elias remembered the metallic scent of blood and damp wool, the silence that followed the gunfire, which felt heavy enough to choke on. The dog's image had leaped out at him. Not just a picture, but a tiny window into an alternate reality where this conflict didn't exist, where life was measured in walks and dinner scraps, not meters gained or lost. Elias had intended to hand everything over to the field sergeant, the transit pass, the few crumpled banknotes, the wallet itself. But when he slid the photograph out, catching a glimpse of the fierce, loyal, yet intensely mundane affection reflected in the man's awkward smile, a wire snapped in his mind. He slipped the photo into his own inner tunic pocket, a tiny, illicit warmth he knew he shouldn't possess. It was the only thing Elias kept, lying later to the sergeant, claiming the wallet was empty except for worthless currency. That lie cemented the photo's importance, transforming it from a piece of enemy intelligence into a heavy moral anchor. The worst part about the waiting was the relentless cycle of imagining and forgetting. Elias could construct an entire life for the man in the photograph based solely on the tilt of his head and the dog's scruffy ears. Maybe the man was a carpenter, hands rough from sawing timber. Maybe the dog slept at the foot of his bed, its rhythmic breathing a constant reassurance against the night. Elias remembered Barnaby, His own family's Labrador back on the farm in the western provinces, miles and years away from this freezing, scarred landscape. Barnaby had had that same look of patient expectation when Elias would reach for the leash. The terrifying realization that struck Elias tonight, amplified by the desperate loneliness of the watch, was that the simple, fundamental human act of loving a pet, the pure, undesigning loyalty it inspired, was universal. It was the only unwarped thing left. Both men, regardless of the flag they were forced to fight under, had a creature waiting for them, or had waited for them, whose existence was defined by warmth and belly rubs. How had the systems of man, the high commands, the political borders, the ancient feuds, managed to make enemies out of two men who were essentially identical in their quiet capacity for tenderness? This photograph wasn't just proof of the enemy's humanity. It was a mirror reflecting Elias's own rapidly deteriorating sense of self. It showed him that the man he killed was not a political ideal or a unit number, but a private citizen whose greatest crime might simply have been answering a call to service he couldn't refuse. And that knowledge, unlike the sound of incoming mortar fire, offered no adrenaline, only profound grief. If a man can look at the face of the enemy and see only the reflection of himself, how can he ever truly believe in the necessity of the fight? I have to ask you, watching this story unfold, is there a point in war where shared humanity outweighs the necessity of duty? Please share your thoughts in the comments below, because sometimes, in these quiet moments, only a shared perspective can pierce the silence. The moon rose late, cutting the valley into stark shadows and slivers of harsh, brilliant white. The cold intensified, settling like a physical burden on Elias's shoulders. He tucked the photo away again, fearful that if the corporal came up for a quick check, the glimpse of that small piece of paper would require an explanation he couldn't afford to give. A private shrine to a dead enemy was not something appreciated in the trenches. It wasn't just the treason of carrying enemy material. It was the soft implication of empathy, a weakness that could shatter morale faster than a flanking maneuver. Elias found himself analyzing the details of the man's face again, not from the picture, but from memory. The way the uniform collar chafed his neck, the thinness of his lips, the almost pleading look in his eyes as he went down. He hadn't looked like a hardened killer. He looked like a man who was tired and cold, exactly like Elias felt now. He realized the man had probably not been thinking about his rifle or his squad or the grand geopolitical struggle in his final seconds. He was thinking of warmth, maybe of that dog, maybe of the sensation of coming home to a simple, predictable noise, the clack of claws on a wooden floor. The true tragedy wasn't the man's death, which was a footnote in the casualty reports. The tragedy was that Elias now carried the weight of the man's lost future, a future symbolized entirely by a muddy pawed, indifferent dog. Elias was suddenly tasked with remembering a life he had been ordered to extinguish, a life that included long walks in the woods and quiet evenings by a stove. The silence of the watch became vast and oppressive, stretching out not just across the valley, but across time itself, burying every simple, civilian hope under layers of ice and iron. He gripped his rifle tightly, its cold metal a painful contrast to the false warmth of the memory he now guarded. The first streaks of dawn were the color of bruised plums and ash. The biting cold eased only marginally, enough to allow Elias to stand, stamping his frozen feet on the wooden floorboards of the bell tower. The watch was ending. He looked across the silent, unbroken field of white, no longer seeing targets, but ghosts. Every mound of snow, every blackened tree stump, seemed to harbor the memory of simple lives now ended. He had carried the photo through the entire night, a constant, abrasive reminder of the thin, terrifying line between combat and murder. He would not destroy it. He realized with absolute clarity that this photograph had become his only true piece of war intelligence, not about troop movements or supply routes, but about the true cost of existence here. It was a tangible, undeniable tether back to a world where affection was real and motives were pure, a world rapidly fading from his own memory. Elias finally slipped the photo into the deepest pocket of his uniform, the one reserved for personal, essential items. It would remain his secret, his silent act of rebellion against the dehumanization of the front. He would carry the image of the enemy's dog, because the dog's existence proved the man he killed was capable of love, and if that capacity for love was universal, then Elias himself had not yet completely lost his soul. It was a heavy burden, but the alternative, total oblivion, was far worse. As his relief arrived, bringing the smell of stale coffee and damp wool, Elias descended the stairs, carrying the morning's grim reality, but also the impossible lightness of a dog's remembered face. If this quiet story of fractured humanity and the unexpected bonds forged in the silence of conflict touched your heart, please subscribe to Quiet Soldier Stories and join us again for another meditation on the unseen truths of war.